The summer of 1886 came to the James River Valley the way it always did, without asking and without apology. The grass burned yellow by July. The sky pressed down white and flat in the afternoons, and the few trees along the river stood absolutely still, as though they had decided not to fight it. The road that ran east from the settlement toward Huron cut through prairie that looked in those weeks like the surface of something abandoned. A man driving a wagon along that road in the second week of July would have seen nothing unusual about the Halvorsen property. The gray clapboard house set back from the track, the barn with its south-facing lean-to, the kitchen garden fenced against rabbits, the old woodshed standing 20 feet behind the house on slightly higher ground. He might have slowed his horse when he noticed the pile of gray clay behind the barn 4 feet high and still growing, its color different from the surrounding soil. He might have squinted toward the woodshed and seen the door propped open despite the heat and the faint movement of someone working inside. He would not have stopped. People in that part of Dakota Territory had learned that the Halvorsen widow did not invite questions, and that watching her too long gave you the unsettling feeling that you were the one being studied. She was 58 years old that summer. She had been on that piece of ground for 15 years, which was longer than most, and longer than all of the families who had arrived after 1878, and still talked about the country as though it might yet surprise them. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked without interruption for 3 decades. The knuckles enlarged, the skin at the wrist thickened into something closer to leather than flesh. She stood 5 feet 4 inches and had not changed that height since she was 16. Though everything else about her had been rearranged by time and work, and a particular quality of loss that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates the way silt accumulates in a riverbed, until one day the current runs differently than it used to, and you cannot say exactly when the change began. Her name was Sigrid Halvorsen, and she had come to Dakota Territory in 1871 with her husband Rolf, and a set of convictions that had not softened in the years since, only refined themselves into something harder and more specific. She had not followed Rolf west. She had argued for it, planned for it, read every account of the Homestead Act she could find in the 2 years before they applied, and made the calculations herself on a piece of brown paper she kept folded in the cover of her Bible until it fell apart from handling. Rolf was the builder. She was the one who decided what needed to be built. That distinction had been clear between them from the beginning, and it was one of the reasons their 15 years together had worked when other marriages in the settlement had strained and fractured under the pressure of winters that tested every assumption a person arrived with. They had come in late April, which was early enough to break ground, but not early enough to plant anything that first year. The land agent in Yankton had given them a quarter section along the James River, 160 acres of prairie grass that had never seen a plow, and Rolf had stood at the edge of it and said nothing for a long time, while Sigrid walked the perimeter with her eyes on the ground, reading the soil. Clay-heavy near the river, darker and looser, as you moved east toward the slight elevation where the woodshed would eventually stand. She told Rolf where to build the first shelter. He built it. They spent that first winter in a sod house, walls 2 feet thick, roof of prairie grass over a frame of salvaged cottonwood floor of packed earth. The temperature inside on the coldest nights of January was 38 degrees when they let the fire go out. 38 degrees sounds survivable until you have spent 16 hours at 38 degrees and understand what it means for pipes and food stores and the bones of a woman who is trying to carry a child. She had learned to manage cold before she ever saw Dakota. Her father, Torsten Halvorsen, had been a farmer in the hill country of upper Minnesota, a man who had come from Norway as a young man and brought with him a set of habits so deeply ingrained that he could not have explained their origins any more than he could have explained why he breathed. He kept his wood covered. He never stacked it against the house wall. He placed his root cellar on the east-facing slope of the small rise behind the barn, not because east was philosophically better, but because the east face caught less direct wind and stayed 2 degrees warmer in January than the west face, and 2 degrees in January was not nothing. He had built in 1858 a small stone heating chamber beneath the floor of his root cellar, an odd structure that Sigrid had played around as a child without understanding what it was noticing. Only that the floor of the cellar was always warmer than the floor of the house, and that in the worst weeks of February, when the rest of the farm was fighting the cold, the root cellar felt like a different season entirely. Her father called it the heat core. He had learned the principle from an older man in the community who had carried it from Norway, a system that drew on the same logic as the Roman hypocaust, the underfloor heating chambers that warmed ancient bathhouses by circulating hot air through channels beneath the stone. The version her father built was cruder and simpler and required no expertise beyond patience and the willingness to move several tons of rock by hand. The principle was straightforward: stone holds heat far longer than air, and stone does not run out. If you heat a sufficient mass of dense, slow-conducting material and seal it below ground where the temperature is stable year-round near 42 degrees Fahrenheit, that stored energy bleeds upwards slowly and steadily for days. Not the explosive heat of a large fire burning hard. Something quieter than that, something that felt almost biological, like warmth from a living body, rather than from a combustion event. Her father had said it felt like the earth breathing. He had said this once when Sigrid was 11 years old, and she had remembered it the way children remember things that are said by adults, who are not usually poetic with particular sharpness. The way you remember the one time a reserved person let something true slip through. She had been 11 years old the morning her father fired the heat core for the first time. She came down to the kitchen in bare feet on a January morning, when ice had formed on the inside of the windows, which was normal, which was expected, which she had seen every winter of her life, and the floor under her feet was warm. Not warm like standing near a stove, warm like summer earth, steady and certain and coming from below, from somewhere deep enough that it did not fluctuate when a door opened or a wind gust hit the north wall. She stood there for a long moment before she understood what had changed, and when she looked up, her father was watching her from across the room with his coffee cup in both hands, and he said, "Stone doesn't forget warmth as fast as people forget what they owe each other." She carried that line for 47 years. She carried it through the Atlantic crossing and through the first Dakota winter, and through Rolf's death, and through the fever year, and through the particular silence of a house where a child used to live. She carried it the way you carry something that doesn't make sense yet, but that you know you will need, folded and stored and not thought about consciously, until the night in January of 1886, when she was lying on her back in the crawl space under her kitchen floor at 11 o'clock at night, in 22 below zero temperature, with a pipe wrench in her numb hands, and water dripping from a split copper line onto her face, and she thought, "This is the last winter I do this the old way." The pipe had burst at the joint where the supply line turned north toward the kitchen pump. She had known it might. The crawl space under the kitchen ran shallow, 18 inches of clearance at the highest point, and the insulation she had packed against the foundation joists in the fall had shifted in places. She had meant to repack it in November, and had not, because November had been the month she spent replastering the chimney after a crack opened in the south face, and there were only so many hours of reasonable light in a November day. The repair took her 3 days. 3 days of crawling in and out of that space with a bucket and a torch and a pipe wrench, and hands that she had to stop working every 40 minutes to warm against her stomach before the joint stopped responding. She was 58 years old. She had been doing this for 15 years. The pipe repair cost her 11 feet of copper tubing and $6 in fittings from the hardware in Huron, which she drove to and from in a single day, with Frost pulling the wagon at his steady old man pace, both of them grim and purposeful, and not inclined to linger. Frost was 15 years old that winter. He was a Norwegian fjord horse, compact and broad-chested, with the characteristic dark stripe running from mane to tail, and a personality that Rolf had once described as professional, meaning he did the work assigned to him without drama, and reserved his energy for tasks that mattered. He had come with them from Minnesota in 1871. He was the last living thing on the property that had known Rolf, a fact that Sigrid did not think about directly, but that was present in the way she talked to him, which was more than she talked to most people, and with a different quality of candor. When she found his ears had been frost damaged that January, the outer edges of both pinna pale and stiff, the tissue gone wrong in a way she recognized and feared. She stood in the barn for a long time, with her hands cupped around the sides of his face, and said nothing useful, which was not her habit, and which told her something about what that winter had taken from her, that she had not budgeted for losing. The crawlspace incident and Frost's ears happened within the same week. She noted both in the small ledger she kept on the shelf above the kitchen window, where she tracked her firewood consumption and the temperatures at dawn. The ledger showed 7 cords burned by mid-February. Her best previous year was 5.5. The margin was not sustainable, not at the price wood was running that year, and not at the pace her body was moving through work that had been manageable at 43 and was becoming something else at 58. That was not self-pity. That was inventory. She lay in the crawl space on that January night and looked at the underside of the kitchen floor and understood that the cold was not the enemy. The enemy was the arrangement, the particular combination of decisions that left her fighting the same losing battle every winter, with marginally better tools and marginally less physical capacity, while the cold itself never varied and never got worse and never got better, and simply continued to be exactly what it was, predictable and absolute and completely indifferent to the effort she spent against it. She thought about her father's heat core for the first time in years. Not nostalgically, practically the way you think about a tool when you realize the tool you are using is the wrong one. Wrong mantu aidanits. She began planning in February. By March, she had the dimensions in her head. By May, she had sourced the timber she would need to prop the woodshed floor during excavation. She had already decided not to discuss it with anyone, not because she expected mockery, though she expected that, but because explaining the plan before it existed in stone and earth required her to spend energy on words that she preferred to spend on work. And because she had learned over 15 years of Dakota solitude that the only argument with real force is the one made by a finished thing. She started digging in June, 19 days. She worked in the mornings, starting at 5 when the air was still cool enough that the clay had some give in it, stopping by 10 when the sun had baked the surface back to its summer hardness. She moved the excavated soil by wheelbarrow to the low ground behind the barn, gray clay, transitioning at about 18 inches from the dark topsoil into the dense plastic subsoil that held its shape when compressed. 4 tons of material approximately. She kept count by wheelbarrow load and did not think about the total, because the total was large and she was not in the habit of frightening herself with arithmetic. The hole measured 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, roughly the volume of a small room tipped on its side. She dug it entirely beneath the existing footprint of the woodshed, which required her to leave the woodshed standing and work around it. A problem she solved with 6 pine poles purchased from a mill in Huron for 60 cents a piece, used as temporary props to support the woodshed's floor while she excavated the earth beneath it. The poles were 8 inches in diameter, and she set them carefully, checking the floor above for flex before committing her weight to the work below. The woodshed floor was already elevated on wooden sills above grade. She reinforced the ceiling of the new chamber by nailing 2 additional layers of 1-inch pine planking across the floor, joists from above bringing the total thickness to just under 4 inches, enough to carry the weight of a full load of stacked wood without transmitting it to the stone walls she was about to build. Rolf had died in September of 1879. Not by blizzard or fever, or any of the causes that Dakota Territory had in abundance, but by a ladder that slipped on dry ground on a clear afternoon while he was repairing the roof of the barn he had built with his own hands. He was 31 years old. The fall was 20 feet, and the ground was hard, and he died before Sigrid reached him from the kitchen garden, where she had been working 40 yards away. Clara was 5 years old and had been inside the house and had not seen it. Sigrid had been the one to find him, and the particular quality of that finding, the stillness of a man who had been animated by competence and physical purpose every day she had known him, was something she had absorbed into her body rather than processed through words, and that had remained there for the 12 years since, not as grief exactly, more as a recalibration of what the world was capable of on an ordinary afternoon in September. She did not sell the land. She did not return east to her family in Minnesota. She hired a seasonal hand and taught herself everything Rolf had done that she did not already know, which was less than the neighbors expected and more than the land required. People respected her in the way communities respect self-sufficiency when it is demonstrated consistently over years. They borrowed her auger and returned it without conversation. They did not fully understand her and had mostly stopped trying, which was an arrangement she found acceptable. Clara had grown up on the James River land, a child who knew how to read a barometer before she could multiply, who could identify grasses by their seed heads and name clouds by their formation. She had her mother's attention and her father's ease with physical space, moving through the farm with the confidence of someone who understood the rules of the place she inhabited. She was not a delicate child. Dakota Territory did not produce delicate children. In the spring of 1883, when she was 9 years old, a fever moved through the settlement and took 3 children in a single week. Clara ran a temperature of 104 for 4 days. Sigrid did not leave her bedside. She did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch across those 4 nights, monitoring the fever, with the focused attention of a person who understands that the difference between a manageable situation and a catastrophic one is often a matter of hours, and that the hours require presence. Clara survived. But Sigrid could not stop seeing in the weeks afterward the particular vulnerability of a child in a place that had no obligation to be survivable. The settlement was thin. The nearest doctor was 23 miles away. The next fever could be worse or faster, or the winter between the fever and the doctor could be impassable. She thought about this for a year. She thought about it while she was breaking ground and mending fences and smoking meat and tracking the barometer at dawn. And in the spring of 1884, when Clara was 10 years old, Sigrid made the decision that extracted something permanent from her chest and did not give it back. She sent Clara to St. Paul, Minnesota to live with a cousin's family who had a proper house and a school within walking distance and a doctor 2 streets away. She did not ask Clara whether she wanted to go. She understood that if Clara had a voice in the matter, the outcome would be the same, but the cost would be higher because Sigrid would have to perform certainty she did not entirely feel, and Clara would have to perform acceptance she did not entirely feel, and both of them would spend the parting carrying something unnecessary. She said it plainly. "You are going to Minnesota. The arrangements are made. The cousin's family is good people, and I will write you every 2 weeks without fail." On the day the wagon came, Sigrid stood at the gate and watched it until it turned south toward the Huron Road, and the dust hung in the still air for a long time after the wheels had gone quiet. Then she went inside and sat on the kitchen floor, in the particular silence of a house that has recently lost a presence. It was built around, and she stayed there for 2 hours doing nothing at all, which was the only time in her adult life she had permitted herself the luxury of complete inaction, and which cost her more than any of the work had ever cost her. She kept every letter Clara sent in a tin box the color of faded green paint stored under the bed, where the floor temperature was most stable. The first years, Clara wrote weekly long letters full of the specific observations of a child discovering a city, the way street lamps looked in fog, the food the cousin's family ate on Sundays, the names of girls at school who became friends and then became less than friends and then became something more durable. By 1885, the letters came twice monthly. By 1886, they came once a month shorter. The details less specific, the questions about the farm less frequent. Sigrid wrote back every 2 weeks without variation. She described the weather and the firewood figures and the behavior of frost and the state of the kitchen garden. She did not describe loneliness because loneliness was not a condition she recognized in herself as distinct from the general texture of her life, which had been solitary since 1879 and had organized itself accordingly. Jonas Brennan saw the dirt pile in the second week of July. He was driving past the rear fence line with a load of split pine when he noticed the gray mound rising behind the Halvorsen barn, a color wrong for the topsoil, a volume wrong for anything routine. He slowed his horse. He could see Sigrid through the open woodshed door moving steadily in the dimness inside the sound of the wheelbarrow, reaching him faintly over the ambient noise of the July prairie. Jonas Brennan was 44 years old, a third-generation Norwegian farmer who had arrived in the territory in 1877 and built a reasonable operation 2 miles to the east over 9 years of incremental effort. He was not an unkind man. He categorized things efficiently, and the category he reached for when he looked at the gray dirt pile and the working figure in the woodshed was the one labeled widow trouble, meaning a situation that might require the community to mobilize some form of attention. He stopped his wagon at the fence and called over. Sigrid came to the door and told him plainly a heating chamber beneath the woodshed floor lined with granite connected to the house by a clay-sealed tunnel. Thermal mass. The stone would hold heat from a controlled burn and release it slowly over days, warming the crawl space under the kitchen and reducing her firewood consumption by a significant margin. Jonas listened with the expression of a man waiting for the explanation to arrive at something recognizable. It did not arrive there. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. He said he hoped she wasn't working too hard in the heat. He drove on. That evening, he told his wife Margaret what he had seen and heard. Margaret Brennan listened with her full attention. She gave everything her full attention, which Jonas had found attractive when they married, and occasionally found exhausting in the years since. And then she said, "She's been doing something like this her whole life. She knows something we don't." Jonas said he wasn't sure what that meant practically. Margaret said she wasn't sure either, but she'd like to know more about the tunnel. The story reached Reverend Elias Voss by the following Sunday, filtered through 2 other families and softened by the distance. By the time Reverend Voss heard it, the heat chamber had become some kind of underground structure. Reverend Voss was a Norwegian Lutheran minister of the old school, careful, sincere, possessed of a deep conviction that the community's well-being was his responsibility. He mentioned after the service in a tone of mild general concern that it might be worth someone checking in on the Halvorsen widow who had been living alone on that quarter section for 7 years now, since the child went to Minnesota. Several people agreed that yes, someone should probably check on her. No one did. This did not surprise Sigrid. She had not expected anyone to check on her, and she worked through July and into August without interruption, which was what she had wanted. The stone selection took 4 days in late July. She drove south 3 miles to a dry creek bed she had discovered in her second year on the property, where seasonal water had worked through the landscape long enough to deposit a useful collection of flat-faced cobbles in the exposed substrate. She needed granite, not sandstone, which fractured under rapid temperature cycling, and not limestone, which absorbed moisture and complicated the thermal behavior she was engineering. Her father had taught her to test stone when she was 10 years old. Knock it against another stone, listen for the dry crack of dense material versus the dull thud of something porous. Granite held heat without fracturing and released it predictably. She walked the creek bed for hours, picking up individual stones, testing each one: weight, surface geometry, the sound. She was looking for 3 qualities: density, flatness on at least 2 faces, and a minimum thickness of 3 inches. She rejected more than she kept. Frost pulled 11 loads over 10 days, each load approximately 800 pounds across the 3 miles of summer-dry track between the creek and the homestead. He was 16 that summer, slower than he had been in his prime, his pace measured and deliberate where it had once been brisk but steady in the way of animals that have learned the difference between effort and waste. She watched him work. and thought not for the first time that he had always understood something about conservation that the people around him were still figuring out. By the time the stone was in, she had accumulated roughly 4,200 pounds of granite cobble in and around the excavated chamber. She stacked the wall stones dry, no mortar, a technique her father had used, which modern builders would recognize as dry stacked thermal mass construction. The gaps between stones were intentional, no wider than a quarter-inch in most places. But present, they allowed hot combustion gases to penetrate the interior of the stone mass during a firing heating rock that was 6 and 8 inches from the surface rather than only the faces. Her father had explained this when she was young, and she had understood it then as a child understands things through the warm floor and the cold window and the contrast between them. She understood it now with 40 years more behind it, which was a different kind of understanding, and not necessarily better, only more articulate. The floor of the chamber she paved in flat stones bedded into 2 inches of packed clay mixed with fine creek sand. 3 parts clay to 1 part sand, tamped in layers and left to set. The surface was not smooth, but it was solid and it would not shift under weight, which was what mattered. At the north end of the chamber, directly beneath a gap she had planned in the woodshed's north wall framing, she built the firebox, 30 inches wide, 20 inches tall, 18 inches deep. Constructed from the densest granite she had collected, the interior face plastered with a thick mixture of clay and wood ash that she worked to a consistency she would later describe in a letter to Clara as similar to very stiff biscuit dough. Not quite pourable, not quite rollable, something in between that held its shape when pressed into corners and sealed around the stones without crumbling. The firebox had a single front opening sealed with a fitted stone door that could be lifted free and set aside. The door was not hinged. It sat in a shaped channel held in place by gravity and by a bead of clay packed around the lower edge that could be broken and replaced each firing. This was not elegant. It was functional, which was the same thing in her father's vocabulary and had become the same thing in hers. The combustion gases from a fire in that box did not go up and out through a chimney in the conventional sense. Sigrid had laid a low flue channel 4 inches tall, 6 inches wide, constructed from flat stones set in a covered trench, running from the back of the firebox along the floor of the chamber in a long S-curve that traveled the full 12-foot length of the space before rising through the far wall and exiting through a clay seal pipe inserted through the woodshed's south wall at ground level. The curve was not decorative, it was mechanical. It forced the hot exhaust to travel 26 linear feet through intimate contact with the granite mass before reaching the exit point. 26 feet of contact between exhaust gases running at approximately 300 degrees Fahrenheit and the surrounding stone. By the time the gases left the chamber, the stone had taken most of what the fire had generated. The exit air ran close to ambient temperature. The heat had surrendered itself to the rock. The final element was the tunnel. Running from the southeast corner of the chamber at floor level, a clay-lined passage 30 inches in diameter and 11 feet long terminating beneath the stone foundation of the house, where it opened into the crawl space under the kitchen floor. She had dug this by hand, lying on her side with a short-handled spade, which was the only tool that fit the geometry of the work, and which left her covered in clay from the waist up for 4 days running. The tunnel was sealed at both ends with fitted stone plugs that sat in shaped clay channels and could be removed or inserted by hand. When the plugs were pulled and the chamber had been charged with heat, warm air migrated through the passage and rose through the gaps between the kitchen floorboards in a slow, steady current. Not a blast of heat, but a presence the way a warm body is present in a cold room without announcing itself. The temperature differential drove it. Warm air rises. The kitchen floor became the delivery point for energy that had been generated hours or days earlier and stored in 4,000 pounds of granite. She finished the last of the clay ceiling on the tunnel in late September. The leaves along the James River had gone yellow. She stood in the finished chamber with a lantern for a long time, not inspecting it. She had inspected every inch more times than she could count, but simply standing in the space she had made. The stone walls reflected the lantern light in the particular way of stone that has been touched by many hands and fitted into place with deliberate intention. She had built this in the ground under a woodshed on a quarter section in Dakota Territory, and it had taken her most of a summer, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was the point. On the day Jonas Brennan came by to return a splitting maul he had borrowed in August, Sigrid was in the woodshed resetting a prop that had shifted, and she left the hatch open, and Jonas looked down through it at the stone floor, and the low tunnel opening and the sealed firebox, and the S-curve flue channel running along the wall. He stood there with the splitting maul in his hand for a moment and said, "Does it work?" Sigrid looked at him evenly. "Ask me in January." Jonas looked at the chamber for another moment. Then he took the maul and went home. The sky to the northwest that evening had taken on the yellow cast that Sigrid associated with nothing good. She had built the chamber. The winter would tell her what it was worth. The 12th of October, she fired it for the first time. 6 splits of dry oak, each 22 inches long, placed in the firebox slowly and with attention. She was not in a hurry. Hurrying a thermal mass firing was the equivalent of hurrying mortar. It did not make the result come faster, it compromised the result. She fed the fire over 4 hours, adding wood only when the previous addition had established its burn pattern, keeping the combustion slow and hot rather than fast and diffuse. Every 30 minutes, she went to the flue exit on the south wall and placed the back of her hand an inch from the opening, the test her father had taught her. If the exit air felt warm, the stone was not yet absorbing efficiently. If the exit air felt neutral or cool, the mass was doing its work. The first hour warm at the exit, the second hour less warm. The third hour she held her hand against the opening for a full minute without discomfort. At hour 4 she stopped adding wood, let the remaining fuel burn down, then lifted the stone door into its channel and packed clay around the lower edge with her thumb. She sealed the exit flue from the outside. She went inside and made supper and did not go back to the chamber. 12 hours later, at 2 in the morning, she could not sleep. She dressed and took the lantern and went out to the woodshed and opened the hatch in the floor and climbed down. 51 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the chamber at chest height. Outside, the October night had fallen to 29. She stood in the chamber for 20 minutes and said nothing, and did not pace and did not examine the walls. She stood in the middle of the room she had built and breathed the air that the stone was breathing back at her, and understood that her father had been right about the earth having something like a memory, not a consciousness, not anything mystical, only the plain physical fact that mass holds what it is given and releases it slowly. And that this quality, this simple thermal stubbornness, was what she had spent a summer excavating from the ground and building into a shape she could use. She went inside and wrote the longest letter she had sent to Clara in 4 years. She told Clara about the chamber, its dimensions, the flue geometry, the tunnel. She told her about Frost's ears and the pipe that had burst in January, which she had not mentioned in her letters at the time, because there had been nothing to say about it that would not have sounded like complaint. She told Clara that she had spent 19 days digging a hole by herself under a woodshed, while the neighbors drove past and wondered whether she had gone strange from solitude, and that she had done this because her own grandfather had done something similar in the hill country of Minnesota, and because some knowledge is worth the trouble of recovering, even if it requires you to spend a summer looking eccentric. She ended the letter with 2 sentences she had not planned. "It works, Clara. The stone remembers." The October cold arrived with the efficiency of a front that has traveled unobstructed across 500 miles of flat country. By the first week of November, the morning temperatures were running in the single digits, and by the second week, there had been 2 nights below 0. Sigrid fired the chamber for the second time on November 8th, 12 splits of oak over 5 hours longer, and hotter than the October test, monitoring the exit flue until the air running from the opening felt neutral against her skin. The chamber temperature the following morning read 53 degrees. She inserted both tunnel plugs but left each one a quarter turn loose enough to allow a thread of warm air into the kitchen crawl space without drawing down the thermal reserve too quickly. The effects were measurable and specific. The kitchen floor temperature, by her estimate, was running approximately 12 degrees warmer than the same period in 1885. Her water barrel stayed liquid through the first 2 cold weeks without supplemental heat in the kitchen. The pipes in the crawl space held. She used less wood in November than she had used in any November she could remember, and she recorded the difference in the ledger without comment. Numbers did not require annotation when they were sufficient. What she noticed and did not record was something harder to quantify. In the evening, sitting near the kitchen stove that she no longer needed to run at full output, she was aware of a quality of warmth in the room that was different from the focused heat of the stove alone, more pervasive, more even across the floor and lower walls. The way a room feels when it has been warm for a long time, rather than when it has been recently heated. Her father had described it correctly. It felt like the earth breathing. It felt like something patient that was not subject to the contingencies that made ordinary heating systems fail, the wood that ran out, the flue that iced, the fire that died while you slept. January arrived with the declaration of something that had been building for weeks. The temperature on the morning of January 10th was -14 and falling. Frost pressed himself against the south wall of the barn and would not leave it, and the kitchen water pump handle had developed a stiffness in its action that she associated with the soil around the intake pipe beginning to conduct cold downward. The barometer had been dropping since the 8th. The sky to the northwest on the evening of the 10th had the particular quality of yellow-gray that was not merely cold, but something worse, the color of weather that has made a decision and is traveling toward the moment of its arrival. She fired the chamber on the 10th, not on the 11th when the signs were unmistakable. On the 10th, when a person less attentive might have seen only the beginning of a cold stretch. She fired it for 8 hours with 9 splits of oak, the longest burn she had done, the most deliberate. She wanted the granite mass at maximum thermal charge before the worst of whatever was coming arrived. Because she had learned from her father that the time to prepare for a crisis is before the crisis makes preparation difficult. When the exit air had run neutral for 90 consecutive minutes, she sealed the firebox and the exit plug and went inside. The chamber temperature the following morning was 58 degrees. Outside, January 11th had brought -14 and the sky the color of iron. The 12th was worse. The temperature at dawn was -19. By midday it had not moved. The wind came from the northwest at a sustained 32 miles per hour, with gusts to 44. And the combination produced an effective cold that she could feel through 2 layers of wool and a canvas coat in the 10 seconds it took her to cross from the back door to the woodshed. She checked Frost twice, moving quickly between the house and the barn. Both times he was eating mechanically from the hay she had put down that morning. The stone apron she had laid along the barn's north and west foundation walls the previous autumn, flat granite laid against the foundation to slow the penetration of frost into the floor soil, had kept the barn floor from freezing, which kept the bedding dry, which kept the lower air in the barn measurably warmer than it would otherwise have been. She had not explained the stone apron to anyone. It had not seemed necessary to explain. The storm held for 9 days. She did not fire the chamber again during those 9 days. The charge she had put in on January 10th was sufficient bleeding warmth upward through the tunnel and through the kitchen floor at the slow, steady rate that granite releases what it has been given, which has nothing to do with the urgency of the situation outside and everything to do with the physics of the material itself. Stone does not speed up because you need it to. It also does not stop. The kitchen floor remained warm. The pipes held. The water barrel stayed liquid. She burned wood only in the kitchen stove at a modest rate for cooking. Her total wood consumption for the 9 days of the storm was 1.5 cords. The previous January, she had burned 3 cords in the same span of cold. She recorded this in the ledger. She cooked. She read by lamplight. She wrote 2 letters. On the 7th day of the storm, Jonas Brennan knocked on her door. She heard the knock from the kitchen and went to the front and opened it. Jonas was standing in the snow with his youngest Annie, 9 years old, small for her age, wrapped in so many layers of wool that she was roughly cubic, held against his chest. The child's face turned into the shelter of her father's coat. His own face had been worked over by the cold in the way that skin looks after extended exposure, not frostbitten, not yet, but stripped raw, and carrying the particular blankness of a person who has been managing fear for several days and has run out of additional resources for managing it. He had burned his last useful wood on the 5th day and had spent the 6th and 7th feeding the stove with broken furniture. First a chair, then the frame of a small table, watching his children's faces for the signs that would tell him when the situation had passed from difficult to something worse. He did not say anything when she opened the door. She stepped back from the threshold. He came in. Margaret Brennan came in behind him carrying the middle child. The older two followed, and Annie came last, still folded against her father's chest, and did not lift her head until she was fully inside with the door closed and the warmth of the kitchen reached her face. Then she looked up slowly, the way an animal emerges from a place it has been hiding. Not all at once, but in stages, testing the new environment before committing to it. 2 hours later, there were 11 people in the house. 2 families had followed Jonas's tracks through the snow because Jonas had told them when he left that morning that he was going to the Halvorsen place because the Halvorsen woman always seemed to know something the rest of them did not, and they had decided his tracks were worth following. Sigrid fed them from the root cellar and from the smoked meat that hung in the cold room off the back of the house. She opened the tunnel plugs to their maximum position, and the kitchen floor ran warm through the night. Annie Brennan fell asleep on the kitchen boards that first night, and woke in the early hours with the quiet confusion of a child who cannot locate the source of something pleasant. She pressed her palm flat to the floorboards and held it there, not speaking, just measuring what she felt against what she expected to feel. Then, "It's warm, Papa. It's coming from the floor itself." Jonas did not answer immediately. He was looking at the hatch in the woodshed floor that Sigrid had shown him that afternoon, the sealed firebox, the S-curve flue, the tunnel, and he was thinking about the chairs he had burned and the cattle he had not yet checked, because the storm had made the barn unreachable, and the question of what exactly he had dismissed when he drove past this property in July and saw the dirt pile and the open woodshed door and decided that the widow had perhaps gone strange from solitude. He had no satisfactory answer to that question. He did not look for one. The storm broke on January 20th. It did not end so much as exhaust itself. The wind dropped over the course of an afternoon. The temperature lifted 4 degrees in 2 hours, and by evening a quiet had settled over the James River Valley that felt, after 9 days of noise and pressure, almost startling. People came out of their houses slowly, and with the cautious expressions of those who are not yet certain the emergency has actually concluded. They looked at the sky. They looked at their fence lines. They counted what had been lost and estimated what it would cost to replace it, and recalibrated the gap between what they had prepared and what the season had required. Jonas Brennan lost 7 head of cattle. 2 had frozen in the open pasture, unable to reach the barn through the drifts. 5 more had died from exposure when the eastern wall of his main barn flexed and cracked under accumulated snow load, admitting wind through a gap he could not seal from inside during the storm. He found them on the morning of January 21st, standing stiff in their positions in the way that retains the posture of living animals and makes the discovery worse. The community assembled informally at the Brennan property on the 24th, and the conversation moved through the predictable stages of disaster assessment before Jonas said what everyone had been thinking. He said it standing near the stove with his coffee in both hands, looking at the floor. "I burned my kitchen chairs on the 5th day, and the whole time 2 miles away. There was a woman who had not burned a stick of extra wood in 9 days, and whose floor was warm enough that my daughter slept on it." The room was quiet for a moment. Reverend Voss stood near the window and said that perhaps the community had been hasty in its assessment of the widow Halvorsen's project. The word hasty carried the weight of everything that had not been said when it should have been. And everyone in the room understood this without anyone pointing it out. What the community did was practical and specific. Jonas Brennan went to see Sigrid the following week. He drove to her property on a Tuesday morning and told her that he wanted to build what she had built beneath his woodshed or his barn, whichever she thought was more suitable, and that he would pay her for the instruction. Sigrid looked at him for a moment and then said the payment was not necessary, and the instruction was. She told him to come back Thursday with a notepad and they would start with site selection. He came back Thursday. He came back the Thursday after that. He brought a notepad and used it. He asked questions that were better than she had expected. Specific structural focused on the relationship between the stone mass and the exit flue geometry, rather than on the surface features of the construction. By the third session, she understood that Jonas Brennan had been watching things more carefully than he let on, which revised her estimate of him upward. In a way she did not communicate, but that informed how much she gave him afterward. 3 other families approached her before the end of February. Reverend Voss came in person, which she had not expected, and which she respected because he was a man who did not find it easy to present himself as the person in need of instruction. He sat in her kitchen and listened for 2 hours without asking questions, which he initially read as passivity, and later understood was his way of making sure he had the complete picture before he spoke. When she finished, he said, "My father built a tile stove himself in 1849, and it stood for 30 years. I thought that knowledge had passed. I see now it only moved." She did not answer him directly. She refilled his coffee. The construction season began in April when the ground thawed. Sigrid supervised all 5 projects simultaneously, moving between properties on a rotating schedule, organized by stage of construction rather than by geography. All the excavations first, then all the stone selection, then all the firebox construction, so that her expertise was applied at each stage while it was most needed. She was not being paid. She had not changed her position on that. What she was doing was the thing her father had done in Minnesota when he taught the families on the adjacent quarter sections how to build their own heat cores, which was the thing his father had done before him, which was the thing you did when you knew something that other people needed, and the winter was coming back in 9 months, regardless of whether you had gotten around to sharing it. Margaret Brennan came to 2 of the construction sessions at her own property and at the Voss property, not because she needed to be there, but because she understood that proximity to the work was a form of knowledge that could not be transmitted second-hand. She watched Sigrid select stone with the attention of a student who is not yet sure what she is learning, but is certain it matters. At the Voss property, after Sigrid had laid the first course of the firebox wall and explained the clay ash plaster, Margaret said, "You've been carrying this your whole life, and nobody thought to ask you for it." Sigrid pressed the plaster into the corner joint with her thumb and said, "People ask for things when they understand they need them. They didn't need it yet." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "We needed it. We just didn't know." By the end of September, all 5 chambers were functional. Sigrid had inspected each one, every plugstone, every clay seal, every inch of flue channel, and had made corrections where the work was imprecise, pointing to the gap and the consequence and the fix in the same sentence. None of this was complex. All of it required attention. What she had noticed over the summer was that the quality she was actually teaching was not masonry or thermal engineering, but something prior to those, the habit of thinking about a problem before it arrived, when there was still time and material and daylight to address it, rather than after it had arrived and taken away the options. The Huron Weekly Plainsman ran 4 sentences about the project in October, buried on page 3, attributing the technique to a Norwegian-born homesteader near the James River, without naming her. Sigrid read the item once, set the paper down, and went back to work. The same week the newspaper item ran, she received a letter from Clara. Clara was 13 now. Her handwriting settled into the even forward-leaning script she would keep for life. The letter was shorter than usual. It described a social function, a new teacher, the early cold in St. Paul. It did not ask about frost. It did not ask about the farm or the winter preparations or the 5 new chambers or what any of it had cost. Sigrid read the letter twice. She folded it along its original creases and put it in the tin box. Then she put on her coat and went out to check all 5 properties in her mental rotation, not because any of them needed it that day, but because the chambers needed to be verified before the cold came, and verification was always better done once more than once too few. And because movement was the thing she had instead of the other available responses, and she had learned long ago that available was not the same as useful. The autumn of 1887 was the autumn that people in the settlement began to change the way they thought about winter. Not dramatically, not through any announced decision. It happened in the way gradual changes happen in communities that do not like to examine themselves explicitly through small behavioral shifts that accumulated into a different orientation. Families that had always stacked cordwood against exterior walls began placing it closer to interior access points. People watched the barometer more consistently and cross-referenced their observations with what their animals were doing. The topic of what Sigrid Halvorsen had built came up in conversations not as curiosity or local color, but as a reference point, as in what she had done was now the baseline against which preparedness was measured. She was not present for most of these conversations. She was not present for most things said about her and had not been for years. What she was present for was the work and the October inspection rounds, and the evenings by lamplight and the letters she wrote to Clara every 2 weeks without fail. November moved through its paces. December arrived. The cold was serious but not yet extreme. Sigrid had fired her own chamber twice since October, maintaining the thermal reserve, adjusting the tunnel plug positions in response to the specific cold profile of each week. She had added one modification to her own system that she had not included in the 5 community builds: a secondary stone shelf running along the east wall of the chamber at mid-height, which increased the total granite mass by approximately 300 pounds and gave her an additional 12 to 15 hours of thermal hold time during extended cold periods. She had not put this into the community builds because it required a precise adjustment to the exit flue grade that she was not yet certain the other builders could execute correctly without her present. And she preferred to introduce it in the second construction season when she could supervise it properly. January 10, 1888 was warm by January standards. 20 degrees, nearly windless, the sky high and even. Frost refused his morning feed entirely. The barometer had been dropping since the 8th. The sky to the northwest at midday had the yellow-gray cast she had seen before, the color of weather that has already decided what it is going to do. She fired the chamber that afternoon. 10 hours, the longest burn she had ever run, the most deliberate she had ever been. She wanted every grain of thermal capacity in that granite mass charged to its absolute limit. She monitored the exit flue every 15 minutes. And when it ran cool for 2 uninterrupted hours, she sealed the firebox and the exit and inserted the tunnel plugs at 3/4 open. The chamber temperature the following morning was 60 degrees. She had never achieved 60 degrees before. Outside it was 12, and the clouds had come in low and heavy from the northwest, moving faster than clouds usually move in January. January 12, 1888. The morning was clear and the temperature held near 20, and people in the settlement sent their children to school because the weather seemed for January almost manageable. Farmers went out to their outbuildings with the ease of men who have been penned by cold for months and are glad of a reason to move. The light was clean, the sky was high and open. At 2 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours. The wind hit 70 miles per hour before the instruments at the Huron weather station failed and stopped recording. The snow that came with it did not fall. It moved horizontally dense and total, reducing visibility to the length of an arm in less than 5 minutes. People who had been outside when it hit had seconds to make decisions, and the decisions that were made in those seconds determined what happened next for some of them and what did not happen for others. Children died walking home from school across the broader territory, not in the immediate settlement, but across the wide band of Dakota and Nebraska and southern Minnesota that the storm cut through without warning. They died because the drop had been too fast, the warning too brief, the distance home too far. Adults died steps from their own doors, disoriented by the total whiteness into walking in circles, spending heat they could not replace until they sat down in the snow and did not get up. Livestock died by the hundreds of thousands. The open-range cattle industry that had been building since the end of the Civil War was financially broken by the losses of that week and the weeks that followed, broken in a way it would not recover from, because the land had demonstrated at scale what it was capable of when it decided to demonstrate it. In the settlement along the James River, in the 5 properties with functioning thermal mass chambers, and Sigrid Halvorsen's own farm at the center of all of it, the storm arrived as a crisis and was met as one. Jonas Brennan got his children into the house and his remaining cattle into the barn before the full force hit, because he had been watching the temperature drop since noon and had not told himself it was nothing. He moved with the purpose of a man who had learned at some cost the previous year what the difference between attention and inattention looked like when winter decided to collect on it. He did not burn any furniture. He did not run out of wood. On the second day, when the wind was still running hard enough to flex the kitchen windows in their frames, Sigrid heard the sound she had been half expecting since the storm began, the knock at the door from outside the preparation she had made from people who had not had anyone to teach them what she had spent a summer building and a winter proving. 4 of them, 2 men and a woman and a child of perhaps 5 years, from a wagon that had been traveling the Huron Road when the storm hit and had found the fence line by feel and followed it east through 2 miles of whiteout until they saw the lamp in her kitchen window. They did not knock so much as fall against the door. The child was not crying. Children who have been cold long enough stop crying, which is one of the signs that the situation has moved past a certain threshold. Sigrid stepped back from the door. Jonas Brennan came 4 hours later. His entire family, because the hole in his barn wall from the previous year's storm had been repaired. But a different section of roofing had begun to fail under the accumulated snow load, and the barn temperature was dropping in a way that threatened his cattle. He needed the Halvorsen kitchen the way he had needed it a year before, not as a refuge, but as a margin, the difference between managing and not managing. He came through the door without hesitation this time, without the stripped raw look of a man who has been fighting something too long. He came through the door the way someone comes through a door they have earned the right to come through, and he got his children settled, and then turned around and went back out into the storm to help the 4 strangers bring their wagon horse into the barn, because that was also what you did. Reverend Voss and his wife arrived the following morning. Their 2 children in a carry sled, because the Voss chamber was functioning correctly. But the house was small, and the thermal reserve had been sized conservatively in the first construction season, and the extended cold of a 3-day storm was drawing it down faster than it was designed to handle. He knocked and waited, and when Sigrid opened the door, he looked at her and said, "I should have listened more carefully the first time you explained it." Sigrid moved aside and let them in. 13 people in the house across those 4 days. The kitchen floor ran warm through all of it. Frost survived in the barn, bedded on dry straw over the stone apron floor, generating the steady metabolic heat of a large animal that has been kept out of the wind and given enough to eat. He was 17 years old. He worked at the problem of survival with the same professional equanimity he had brought to every other problem assigned to him across the years. Annie Brennan, 10 years old on this second winter in the Halvorsen kitchen, did not sleep on the floor this time. She sat next to it and pressed her palm flat to the boards the way she had done the year before. And then she looked up at Sigrid across the room and said nothing, just held her gaze for a moment. The particular look of a child who has just confirmed something she already believed, but needed to verify in person. Sigrid looked back at her. The look said everything the situation required without requiring anyone to say it. When the storm broke and the community began its accounting, the arithmetic was different from the previous January. The 5 properties with chambers had sustained no deaths, no frostbite cases, no burst pipes, no livestock lost to cold. The farms without chambers had losses across all those categories. The territory at large had lost an estimated 1 million cattle. What had happened in the James River settlement was not a large-scale solution to what the blizzard of 1888 had done to the northern plains. It was a local answer to a problem that had a local size. But it had worked. And in the specific geography of those 5 properties on those particular nights, working had been enough. Jonas organized the community meeting at his own property, not at the church, not at a neutral location, but at his own kitchen table, which was a statement about where the accountability sat. 11 men came. At the end of 2 hours, Jonas produced paper and a pen and wrote a letter to the land office in Huron, requesting that the thermal mass construction technique developed by Sigrid Halvorsen of the James River settlement be formally documented and made available to any homesteader in the county who requested it. He read it aloud. 11 men signed it. One of them said they should make sure to use her name. Jonas said it was already there. The letter was carried to Huron at the end of February and arrived by the account of the man who delivered it slightly creased from the saddlebag. No formal record of any official response has been found. Sigrid was not at the meeting. Jonas had told her about it and she had said she appreciated the intention. When he told her afterward about the 11 signatures and the letter to the county, she nodded the way she nodded when information was received and filed. She did not express surprise that no official action followed. What she had expected, and what was in fact happening, was quieter and more durable than official documentation. It was the knowledge itself moving through the community, the way it always moved when it had been demonstrated rather than merely described, attaching itself to the people who had watched it work and would carry it forward with them into the next season and the one after. That spring she planted early. The ground thawed 2 weeks before the end of March, unusual for the James River Valley, and she used the extra weeks to expand the kitchen garden and to work the secondary shelf modification into her own chamber, the additional granite course along the east wall that she had been planning since autumn. She did the work alone in the early morning hours, fitting each stone with the same care she had brought to the original construction. And when she was done, she went inside and recorded the modification in the ledger. She wrote a letter to Clara in May that ran to 4 pages, which was longer than her usual correspondence. She described the storm in plain terms, the temperature drop, the wind, the duration, the 13 people in her kitchen. She described Annie's palm pressed flat to the floor on the second night of that second blizzard, confirming what she already knew. She described Jonas coming through the door without hesitation this time, and what that meant. She did not describe her own experience of those 4 days in terms that invited a particular emotional response, because that was not how she wrote. She reported. At the end of the letter, after the specifications and the accounting, she wrote one sentence that she had not planned and did not revise. "I think your grandfather would have said that the point was never to survive the winter. The point was to build something that made the next winter smaller than the one before." She sealed the letter. She put it on the shelf with the others waiting for the weekly post. Outside, the James River Valley was running with snowmelt, the creek beds full and purposeful, moving everything they had been given by the winter toward the lower ground where it could be used. The prairie was beginning to show green under the dead grass, which it did every year, which it had done through every storm and every loss and every winter that had seemed in its worst moments too large to have another side. It always had another side. The question was never whether the spring came. The question was what you had built in the fall. The summer of 1888 was a working summer. She added the secondary shelf modification to 2 of the 5 community chambers, the ones where the original construction had been most precise, and the builders were ready for the added complexity. The other 3 she deferred to the following year, which was not a concession but a judgment. The quality of a thermal mass system was not in its ambition, but in its execution. And execution at that level of precision required a builder who had been through at least one full firing cycle and understood from experience rather than instruction how the stone responded. Frost turned 17 that year. He covered the 3 miles to the Granite Creek bed in 40 minutes rather than the 30. It had taken him in his prime, and he rested longer between loads. His ears had healed cleanly from the frost damage 2 winters before, the tissue recovering most of its original texture, though the very tips remained slightly thickened, a permanent record of what that January had cost him. He ate well. His temperament was unchanged. She watched him work and thought about the same thing she always thought when she watched him work: that he had known Rolf, that he was the last thing on the property that had known Rolf, and that his presence was a kind of continuity she had not asked for, but had come to depend on in ways she did not enumerate. Frost died in December of 1890. Not suddenly, not from cold or injury, but in the measured way that very old horses die when they have given everything they had to give, and there is simply nothing left to draw on. She found him on a Monday morning lying in the barn on his side in the dry straw. His expression the same professional equanimity in death that it had been in life, as though he had approached the problem of dying with the same lack of drama he had brought to every other problem assigned to him. She sat with him for a long time in the cold barn. She did not go inside for 2 hours. She did not record it in the ledger. Some things are not the ledger's business. Clara's letters that autumn were shorter than usual and arrived later than they once had. She was 16, growing into a life in St. Paul that had its own logic and its own schedule, and the correspondence with a mother on a Dakota homestead occupied a smaller and smaller portion of the space available to her. Sigrid wrote back every 2 weeks. She described the barn in the mornings after Frost was gone, the empty quality of it, the way she had taken to leaving the lantern burning a little longer than necessary before she went back inside, not from superstition, but from a reluctance to let the darkness have the space too quickly. She wrote this down in a letter to Clara, and then she read it back. And then she sealed it and put it in the box with the letters she had not sent, because it was the kind of truth that was more useful as a private possession than as a transmitted message. She developed the cough in the spring of 1891. She recognized it within the first week as the kind that does not resolve the chest quality of it, the low fever that appeared in the evenings and was gone by morning, which was the fever's way of declining to announce itself as a problem while still being one. She did not go to the doctor in Huron. The 23-mile trip required a day each way, and the interventions available for the kind of illness she recognized in herself were limited in their likely effectiveness. She planted the kitchen garden in April. She completed the spring inspection of all 5 community chambers, making notes on 2 that needed minor resealing, and 1 that had developed a small crack in the flue channel, requiring a single stone to be reset. She wrote the repair instructions and delivered them in person because she wanted to see the work done correctly, and because she understood, without framing it as such, that there were a finite number of seasons in which she would be able to do this, and she intended to use the ones remaining at full capacity. She wrote a letter to Clara in May that was shorter than usual. She mentioned that she had been less well than usual over the winter and had not fully recovered in the spring, which was the plainest she allowed herself to be on the subject. She did not say what she thought the illness was. She did not ask Clara to come. She wrote the document in late April, 3 pages in her careful hand, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after the day's work was done. She wrote the dimensions of the chamber, the criteria for granite selection, the construction sequence for the firebox and the flue channel, the grade specification for the S-curve, the diameter and length of the clay tunnel, the placement of the stone plugs. She described the back-of-hand test for monitoring exit temperature. She described the firing procedure in the order she had developed it through 2 years of refinement. She wrote it the way her father might have written it if he had been the kind of man who wrote things down, which he had not been, which was why she had been required to carry it in memory for decades instead of in ink. At the top of the first page, she wrote a single line of instruction. Read this completely before beginning. The order of construction is not arbitrary. At the bottom of the third page, after the final specification, she wrote the sentence she had carried since she was 11 years old. The sentence her father had said across the room, with his coffee cup in both hands, while she stood on the warm floor with ice on the windows. Stone does not forget warmth as quickly as people forget what they owe each other. She addressed the envelope to Clara and wrote her name on the outside in her small, even script. She did not put it with the outgoing letters on the kitchen shelf. She put it in the tin box under the bed beneath the letters she had sent, and the letters she had not sent, and the letters Clara had sent, and the years of careful two-week correspondence that had formed the connective tissue between two people separated by distance and by the particular grief of a decision made out of love that could not be unmade. She died in the third week of May, 1891, 62 years old. The neighbor from the Foss household, who had been stopping by on her weekly supply trips since the winter of 1888, found her in the kitchen chair near the cold stove, seated and upright, her hands resting on the arms of the chair. The kitchen was cold, the fire having gone out sometime in the night. The ledger was on the shelf where it always was. The tin box was under the bed where it always was. The chamber under the woodshed was sealed for the season, in the way she always sealed it in May, with the stone plugs seated firmly and a fresh bead of clay pressed around the firebox door edge. She had not left instructions about the property. She had not needed to. The property was Clara's. Clara Halvorsen arrived in Dakota Territory in June of 1895. She was 21 years old, and she had not been on the James River lands since the summer of 1884, which meant she was arriving at a place that existed in her memory as the background of her childhood, and in reality as something that had continued to develop and maintain itself and age in her absence for 11 years. The house was standing, the barn was standing, the woodshed was standing. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds along the perimeter, but held the structure of what had been planted there for 20 years. The permanent herbs at the south end, the root vegetable beds along the east wall, the slight mounding of the soil where generations of compost had built the growing medium above the surrounding grade. The neighbors had been maintaining the property in the interim. Jonas Brennan had cut the grass around the house and barn twice a summer. Margaret Brennan had checked the window seals each fall and reglazed two panes that had cracked in the winter of 1893. Reverend Voss, now retired from the active ministry, but still living on his James River property, had inspected the thermal chamber each spring and fall and made minor repairs as needed. A stone repositioned here, a clay seal refreshed there. He gave Clara his maintenance notes when she arrived, a small stack of papers in his careful handwriting, covering 4 years of observations which he handed to her with the matter-of-fact manner of a man transferring a responsibility he had been holding in trust and was glad to place in the right hands. Clara read the notes that evening by lamplight in the kitchen where she had eaten breakfast as a small child. The chamber notes were specific and technical and made reference to things she did not fully understand. The secondary shelf modification, the exit flue grade, the quarterly tunnel plug inspection. She understood the shape of what they were describing without understanding all the details, which told her what she had already suspected, that her mother had built something here that required the kind of attention the Reverend had been giving it, and that the attention was not casual. She opened the tin box the following morning. She had known the tin box existed. Her mother had referenced it in letters obliquely in the way someone refers to a thing that is too ordinary to require naming. She had not expected its contents to be what they were. The letters she had sent over 11 years, bundled in chronological order and tied with cotton string, that she had expected. What she had not expected was the other bundle, the letters her mother had written to her and not sent. Longer than the sent letters, more unguarded, describing things the regular correspondence had not described, the specific quality of the January nights, the way the pipe repair in 1886 had been, the moment the chamber decision became final, the 3 mornings of watching frost at the east fence line in October of 1887. The 2 hours sitting on the kitchen floor, the day Clara's wagon turned south toward the Huron Road. She read the unsent letters over 2 days. She read them in the kitchen during the day and in the bedroom at night. She learned things about her mother's years on this land that she had not known and had not thought to ask about, because she had been a child when she left and had become someone else in the years since, and had not fully understood that the person she had become did not include the person who had remained here doing this work in this place, writing letters to a daughter who wrote back less and less often. She found no reproach in the unsent letters. That was the thing that stopped her more than once in the middle of a page, the complete absence of accusation or demand. Her mother had written these letters and kept them because the truth in them was too large for the regular correspondence, not because she wanted Clara to feel its weight. The keeping was not a preparation for a reckoning. It was just the record, just what had actually happened, stored in the same careful hand as the firewood figures, because accuracy was accuracy, and her mother had not distinguished between the two. At the bottom of the tin box under everything else was the envelope with her name on the outside. She opened it carefully. 3 pages. The construction document. The specifications for the chamber, the firebox, the flue, the tunnel, the stone selection criteria, the firing procedure, the back-of-hand test, the secondary shelf modification with its grade adjustment, the instruction at the top of the first page. Read this completely before beginning. The order of construction is not arbitrary. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, the sentence she recognized immediately, because her mother had once quoted it in a letter attributed to the grandfather. Clara had never met the man who had built the first heat core in the hill country of Minnesota. Stone does not forget warmth as quickly as people forget what they owe each other. The sentence was not new, but reading it here at the bottom of a technical document her mother had written alone in the evenings of her last spring, with the cough already in her chest, and the last cold winter still in the walls of the house, gave it a different weight than it had carried as a quoted remark in a letter. It was not a philosophical observation anymore. It was the conclusion of a piece of work, the summary of everything the 3 pages above it described, reduced to a single statement that contained all of it and required all of it to be fully understood. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The document was not addressed to her in its text. It had no salutation, no opening directed at a recipient. It was addressed to whoever needed it, which was the point of a technical document. But it was in the envelope with her name on it, which meant it had been written for her specifically. And the coexistence of those two facts, written for everyone, kept for Clara, told her something about the nature of the gift. It was not personal in the way gifts between people usually are. It was personal in the way a tool passed between generations is personal. The marks on the handle are someone else's. The balance of it fits your hand differently than it fit theirs. But the function is the same, and the function is what matters. She went out to the woodshed in the afternoon. She opened the hatch in the floor. She climbed down. The chamber was cold-sealed for the season, the stone walls running at their ambient ground temperature. The secondary shelf along the east wall was exactly as Reverend Voss's notes had described it. The additional granite course at mid-height. The precise grade adjustment to the exit flue visible in the angle of the channel stones. The S-curve ran along the floor in the configuration the document described, and the tunnel opening sat in the southeast corner, where the document said it would be. The stone plugs were seated in their channels with fresh clay, the work of the previous autumn's inspection. 9 years since the chamber was built, and the granite was uncracked. The dry stack joints were tight. The firebox interior, when she lifted the stone door, showed the clay ash plaster, in good condition, darkened by years of firing, but structurally intact. She pressed her thumb against the plaster surface at the corner joint. It held. She stood in the chamber for a long time. The stone was cold, which was appropriate for June. The chamber had not been fired since October, and the ground had not yet transferred summer heat to the mass. In 4 months, when the October frost arrived, whoever fired this chamber would need to follow the procedure exactly as written. The slow, deliberate burn, the 15-minute flue checks, the patient waiting for the hand test to confirm saturation. It was not difficult. It was not magic. It was physics applied with attention, and attention was teachable, and the document in the envelope with her name on it had just taught her. She sat on the woodshed floor with her feet hanging over the edge of the hatch for a long time, looking down at the chamber in the failing light. She had been a child in this yard. She had climbed the fence rail of the kitchen garden and watched frost move through the fields and eaten early peas straight from the vine in July. She had left at 10 years old and had become someone else somewhere else. And the someone else she had become had not asked enough questions of the person who had remained. That was the fact of it, plain and irreversible, and she sat with it the way you sit with things that are true and late and cannot be made earlier. She had not come back in time to know her mother as one adult woman knows another. That conversation had not happened. What she had instead was the tin box and the document and the chamber, and Reverend Voss's maintenance notes, and the ledger on the kitchen shelf with its 11 years of careful entries in the hand that had also written to her every 2 weeks without fail across those same 11 years. These were not a substitute for the conversation. They were something different from a substitute. They were what remained after the person who built them was gone, which was what everything built by careful hands eventually becomes the proof that the building mattered left for whoever comes after. She decided that evening to stay. She wrote to the cousins in St. Paul that week and explained her decision in plain terms. She wrote to Jonas Brennan the same day asking whether he knew of a reliable hand to help her through the first farming season. Jonas arrived in person the following morning with a list of names and the offer of his own time through planting, which she accepted. Margaret came with him, and the two women walked the property together, while Jonas stood in the yard with the patient expression of a man who understands that some conversations are not his to be part of. Margaret stood at the woodshed and looked at the hatch and said, "She never explained herself out loud. She just built things and waited for people to understand." Clara thought about the unsent letters, the document at the bottom of the tin box, the sentence about stone and warmth that had been waiting for her in an envelope with her name on it. "She explained herself," Clara said. "She just chose who got to hear it." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded in the way that Margaret Brennan nodded when something resolved a question she had been carrying for years. The community helped Clara in the way that Dakota Territory communities help people who had demonstrated the intention to stay. Jonas spent 3 weeks teaching her the field rotation system, which was not complex but was precise in ways the ledger did not fully explain. Reverend Voss spent 2 afternoons walking her through the chamber maintenance procedures until she could perform them correctly without reference to the document. Margaret taught her the root cellar inventory system and the smoking schedule for the fall meat, which Sigrid had apparently never written down because she considered it self-evident and which was not self-evident until Margaret walked her through it. Clara fired the chamber for the first time in October of 1895. She followed the procedure in the document, exactly 6 splits of dry oak slow burn, 15-minute flue checks with the back of her hand. At the 3rd hour, the exit air ran neutral against her palm. She continued for the full 4 hours, then sealed the firebox and the exit and waited. 12 hours later, she climbed down into the chamber with a lantern. 53 degrees at chest height in the center of the space. The ground temperature outside had dropped to 28 overnight. She stood in the chamber for longer than the temperature reading required. The stone walls held the lantern light in the way stone holds everything, without choosing to, without effort, simply because holding is the nature of the material. The warmth was not dramatic. It was real, and it was steady, and it came from the stone itself, from 4,200 pounds of granite that had been carried by hand from a creek bed 3 miles south, across 9 growing seasons and 2 surviving blizzards. It had been charged and discharged and recharged across nearly a decade of Dakota winters by a woman working alone, and it had not cracked, and it had not failed, and it had not forgotten a single firing. She came upstairs and opened the ledger to the first blank line below her mother's last entry and wrote the date, the firing duration, the wood quantity, and the chamber temperature at 12 hours. Her handwriting was larger than her mother's, less compressed. But the information was the same kind of information recorded in the same register. Continuing on the page directly below the last line Sigrid Halvorsen had touched. The ledger would continue for another 40 years in Clara's hand, through 2 more severe winters and a drought year, and the deaths of the 5 original community builders one by one as the century turned. She added one modification of her own, a drainage channel around the chamber floor perimeter, to address a moisture problem that developed after the flood year of 1901, recorded in the document with a note identifying it as a site-specific addition. The community chambers were all eventually rebuilt or replaced as the settlement changed and consolidated over the decades. But the knowledge of how to build them had distributed itself widely enough by then that it no longer depended on any single property or any single person to survive. When Clara died in 1952, her daughter found the document in the tin box that Clara had kept under her own bed for 57 years, the original 3 pages in Sigrid's hand, and the 1 additional page in Clara's hand with the drainage modification. The daughter donated both to the James River Historical Society, along with the ledger and the letters. The society archived them in the way that historical societies archive things that are important and specific, and do not feed the large narrative categories that tend to receive the display cases things that are true at the human scale, which is the scale at which most things that matter are true. The woodshed is gone. The house is gone. The barn is gone. Frost's grave behind the east fence line, marked with a flat granite stone that Clara placed in the spring of 1891, when she came back and found the barn empty, is gone. The stone absorbed back into the ground over the decades, the marker outlasted by the memory of what it marked. But if you walked that piece of ground today, the James River country of South Dakota, that quarter section of what was once Dakota Territory, and you knew what to look for, you would find a slight depression in the soil behind where the woodshed once stood. A rectangle 12 feet by 8 sunken at the center, where the roof boards finally gave way sometime in the early years of the last century, and the weight of the earth above pressed down into the empty space below. The granite is still there. 4,200 pounds of flat-faced river stone, dark with age and cold, now holding nothing but the mineral record of what was asked of it across a decade of work. It was carried 3 miles by a woman working alone in the summer of 1886, selected by hand from a dry creek bed, fitted without mortar into walls designed to breathe rather than seal. It was used to store heat that was then given away slowly over days and nights to the people who needed it first. 1 woman alone, then 5 families, then 13 people on 2 blizzard nights. Then a community that carried the knowledge forward into the next season and the one after. The stone was not remarkable. 4,000 pounds of granite from a Dakota creek bed is not a monument. It is material chosen for specific properties and used according to specific principles by a person who understood what those properties were, and why those principles worked, and what it would cost to ignore them. What is remarkable is the patience of the application. What is remarkable is the willingness to spend a summer moving stone by wheelbarrow under the July sun, while the neighbors drove past and offered nothing, and occasionally offered something worse, because the understanding that the cold was coming was more vivid than the discomfort of being considered eccentric, because the knowledge her father had given her was more durable than the mockery of people who had not yet needed it, because she had been cold before and understood at a cellular level that understanding a problem is not the same as being defeated by it. She built it under a woodshed where nobody looked in a space everybody ignored, with methods nobody wanted to hear about. She asked nothing in return. She taught freely what had been freely taught to her. She wrote it down when she understood that writing it down was the last responsible thing she could do. And when the winter came, as the winter always comes, the small space under the woodshed said everything that Sigrid Halvorsen had never found it necessary to say out loud. The stone is still there. It has forgotten nothing.